First of all, my apologies for the silence of the last few weeks. Real-world demands intervened and kept me from making any uploads. That's over now and I'm back on track. In this series on Plato's Cave, we left off with the sun, the first in a three-part sequence culminating in the cave, which sets out an analogy between the sun and the good. Now we turn to the divided line, which immediately follows the sun analogy and precedes the cave itself. I want to linger over this issue of analogy for a moment, because the next image in the three-part sequence culminating in the cave, the divided line, also makes use of analogy, in this case a strictly geometric ratio. Analogy derives from the Greek analogia and is a technical term in geometry. Analogia is rendered into Latin as proportio, from which we get the English proportion. The basic terms in any analogy involve verbal formulations containing is to, as, and is to, either explicitly or implicitly. According to the Dictionary of the History of Ideas, quote, analogy, in its broadest sense, comprehends any mode of reasoning that depends on the suggestion or recognition of a relationship of similarity between two objects or sets of objects. It includes not only four-term proportional relationships of the type A is to B as C is to D, for which the Greek term is analogia, but also both explicit and implicit comparisons, for example, the use of models, paradigmata, and of images, eikones. End quote. The dictionary entry notes that analogy is not just geometric proportion, but denotes any comparison, explicit or implicit. The analogy of the sun and the good are of the second kind, while the divided line that follows will be of the first, geometric kind, namely of the form A is to B as C is to D, which is a continued and detailed exposition of the purely verbal sun analogy. The good is to intelligible things and the power of intellection, as the sun is to visible things and the power of vision. Secondly, the definition uses the example of the model-image relation. This bears directly on the core of the metaphysics being schematized here, where the form F functions as the paradigm of any perceptible particular bearing the property F. Recall from part 1, Socrates remarks, quote, we say that the many beautiful things and the rest are visible but not intelligible, while the forms are intelligible but not visible, end quote, which itself expresses an analogy. Beautiful things are to sight, as the form of beauty is to intelligibility. In other words, the form of beauty, or beauty in itself, which is purely intelligible, is the paradigm of beautiful things, which are visible or tangible. Beautiful things qua beautiful things, then, are the images of beauty itself. In fact, according to a fully developed Platonism, all sensible particulars are images of their invisible but intelligible paradigms. In the Timaeus, Plato's great dialogue on cosmology, we're told that the entire visible cosmos, or universe as we would call it now, is itself an image of the intelligible cosmos. Let's think of an architectural blueprint. The architect conceives and holds a design in their mind, which they can then represent in both two dimensions, the traditional blueprint plans, and nowadays in three dimensions, through the computer-aided design model. These representations are used by the engineers and builders to construct the physical building. The design object is an intelligible geometric structure, in this case, which exists before its physical manifestation in time and, of course, space. Plato's Timaeus introduces us to the figure of the demiurge, a kind of cosmic builder. The word demiurgos is just the everyday Greek word for craftsman. And the demiurge contemplates the formal structure of the cosmos, the so-called intelligible cosmos, but also possesses the causal power to realize this object of contemplation in time and space, just as human builders have the power to realize a physical building from a blueprint. I don't want to get too deep into the Timaeus, so for the moment it will suffice us to illustrate what is meant by the priority of forms to their instances and the nature of that relationship, which can be summarized as follows. The intelligible form F is the original of the sensible instance, that is, any visible, tangible thing bearing the property F, which is the image, eikon. The form is the original, the sensible particular, its image. Moreover, this is not just the case with individual things, but for the entire cosmos itself. The visible cosmos, or what we now would call the physical universe, is an image of the intelligible cosmos. In the Timaeus, the intelligible cosmos is primarily the object of the demiurgic intellect and the paradigm for the visible cosmos. According to the metaphysical scheme Plato outlines here, the world we inhabit, the things which we see, touch, smell, taste, and hear, is a world of images. Particular things, those things we apprehend with our senses, are not the things in themselves, that is, subsistent beings, but are merely images of those subsistent beings, which are the forms. In Plato, then, the sensible world is directly and literally analogous to the intelligible world. This, I think, is the key to understanding the schema of the sun, divided line, and cave sequence from the Republic. With these three interconnected figures and analogical presentations, Plato is presenting a schematization of the hierarchy of reality, ranging from the most fleeting shadows and images of images right up to the good itself, the ultimate source and cause of everything. So, what is at stake here with the analogies articulated in Book 6 of the Republic, the sun and the divided line, brings us into the very core of the kind of metaphysics that Plato is presenting here. He has schematized the order of reality and the corresponding cognitive states that relate to each level, albeit in fairly broad brushstrokes. Now, Plato gives no detailed instructions as to how exactly we should section the line, but traditional depictions of the line has the lowest part, A to B, as half the length of B to C, while C to D is equal in length to B to C, but half the length of D to E. However, there are variations in the depictions scholars have used for illustrating the line. I've included a couple of versions of the divided line as slides for this presentation. And I should emphasize that nothing of great substance hangs on how exactly we depict the divided line, although the two middle segments must be equal in length. Moreover, we're not dealing with an arithmetic mean, but a geometric proportion, for it's quite literally an analogia, a ratio. That is, the numeric values of the segments are of no real consequence, it's only their proportional relations which matter, although here Plato has been less than precise, and I hasten to add that a great deal of scholarly speculation has gone into this very question. Why did Plato not give us more precise instructions as to how we should section the line? While these discussions are very interesting in their own right, it's not crucial for present purposes to engage with them. Each level, marked with a letter, indicates both the class of thing and the kind of cognition that matches that class. For instance, at the lowest level we have images, and so the cognitive state that matches images is called eikasia, for which no English word precisely fits, but means something like imaging. In broad terms, everything below C is the domain of sense objects and sensibility. Everything above C is the domain of intelligible objects and intellection. Each domain contains two levels, AB and BC, and CD and DE. Below the main division of the line at C, we find the domain of perceptible things, and these are the objects of sense perception, and as such can only be objects of belief or opinion. Beginning at the lowest level A, there is eikasia, the state of apprehension of images, and which denotes images of perceptible things, for instance, a painting or a photograph of a tree, a reflection in a mirror, a shadow cast on the ground, and such like. Next, at the level of perceptible objects themselves, the cognitive state corresponding to that is called pistis, meaning literally trust, faith, or even belief, and these are the perceptible objects themselves, the tree which the painter represents, the person who casts the reflection in the mirror, and so on. Above C, we've crossed over into the intelligible domain, and the very first level consists of mathematical objects, points, lines, and numbers. The corresponding cognitive state here he calls dianoia, which is a kind of discursive reasoning. Next up are forms themselves, and the corresponding cognitive state there is called noesis, which is something like pure apprehension or understanding, and which operates through dialectic. In general, what is at the lower level of each division is the likeness of that which is above it. So, A, shadows and images, are a likeness of B, the perceptible objects, and C, the mathematical objects, are a likeness of D, the forms above them. The mathematical objects are likenesses of forms in this sense. The cognitive state that matches the mathematicals is dianoia and proceeds on the basis of hypotheses, which is in the mathematical context are called axioms. Axioms have an hypothetical character in that they are simply assumed, grasped, but it's not necessary to demonstrate them. In order to do geometry, we have to grasp axioms such as a straight line may be drawn between any 2 points, or a circle may be drawn with any given point as center and any given radius. These happen to be 2 of Euclid's 5 axioms of geometry, numbers 1 and 3 respectively. When we represent these things, we end up with this, see the slide. But these figures are representations of these things rather than the things themselves. As representations, they are likenesses of the things they represent. Anytime we specify 2 points, A and B, and the instruction to describe the shortest distance between points A and B, we get this figure and nothing else. A straight line. In the case of the mathematicals and dianoia, we proceed from hypotheses to conclusions, using likenesses such as figures, like the representations of straight lines or circles. But in the highest section, noesis, we proceed from hypotheses to an unhypothetical first principle, the good, through forms and by using dialectic. It's not inaccurate to say in the former we move down from hypotheses, and in the latter we move up. The mathematicals of level C are analogous to the images at level A, in that both are likenesses of what is above them, and so if we pursue the analogy a little further, the perceptible objects of level B, of which A are the images, are analogous to the intelligible objects, the forms, at level D. It would not be wrong then to describe the mathematicals as in some sense images of the forms. The divided line is summarized then at 513e, quote, understanding noesis for the highest, thought dianoia for the second, belief pistis for the third, and imaging ekasia for the last. Arrange them in a ratio and consider that each shares in clarity to the degree that the subsection it is set over shares in truth. End quote. And just a comment here, the divided line can also be understood as describing a kind of truth spectrum, moving from the least true to the most true. Now, this must sound very bizarre to anyone used to truth as belonging solely to declarative sentences containing propositions, where the principle of bivalence or excluded middle rules. For any proposition, there is exactly one truth value, either true or false, so that excludes any notion of a spectrum. Well, this whole issue will become clearer in the cave narrative itself, and we will return to this single issue, that is, this whole question about a spectrum of truth, later in a special talk on Martin Heidegger's interpretation of the cave narrative, which concentrates entirely on this apparently strange notion of a spectrum of truth. So before we begin on the cave narrative in the next video of this series, I want to make some general observations about the unity of all 3 elements, sun, divided line, and cave. The sun analogy begins the sequence by establishing an analogy between the sun and the good. The sun is the source of light and growth and the visibility of objects, as the good is the source of intelligibility and of the being of the objects of intelligibility. See part 1 of this series. The divided line then articulates this analogy in detail, as we've just seen. This articulation is itself a comprehensive metaphysical schematization of the degrees of being, or the levels of reality, if you like, and the cognitive states that relate to each level. In this schema, we have the fundamental elements of the philosophy which later becomes known as Platonism. We leave aside here the vexed question as to whether Plato himself was a Platonist, at least of this kind. One point to note here is that while the good is discussed in the sun analogy, it is not explicitly mentioned in the divided line analysis. It does make a re-entry at the end of the cave narrative. The good, too, which was discussed in the sun analogy, is not present at least not explicitly present in the divided line. It also makes a re-entry at the end of the cave narrative. In the next episode in this series, I will talk through the cave narrative itself. Following that, there will be a number of separate talks in this series on various aspects of the sun and divided line and cave sequence, including its role in the foundations of Neoplatonism, the anthropological political reading of the cave, the use and misuse of Plato's cave in popular culture, and Martin Heidegger's highly influential interpretation of the cave, which focuses on the meaning of truth. For now, though, as always, please like and subscribe. If you want to get in direct contact with me, I'm putting up the channel email address on the screen now. Do drop me a line if you want to comment or even criticize, or even suggest a topic you think I should be dealing with.